at Steve's, which is still on view at the Fabric Workshop until February 21st. I'm gonna share my screen, and the first thing that I wanted to share with all of you is, oh, first of all, can everyone hear me all right? Okay, great. I wanted to show a time-lapse video that our photo archivist, Carlos Avendano, took of the way the light changes within the installation as the sun rises and the sun sets. So you're gonna see the finished installation, and then we'll kind of go back in time. So you probably have a lot of questions about what you're just looking at. It's a really complex and grand illusion, and I'll definitely explain it to you as we go along. But I wanted to go back to the beginning of Samara's residency, and tell you this story, which is really the story of an artist residency at the Fabric Workshop that became really extraordinary for various reasons, but one of which is this unprecedented time that we're all in, and the call that all of us felt at the Fabric Workshop to really reflect and respond to the emotional experience of this moment, and to use this exhibition and to use technology to reach out to the public in any way. So the first thing that happens when an artist comes to the Fabric Workshop is the artist gets introduced to the staff at the Fabric Workshop, and especially starts this relationship with the studio staff. And on our studio staff, we have 6 artists, and they're all really talented, versatile artists who have honed this really specialized skill of collaboration. And they really learn to listen and to communicate effectively and to inhabit the creative world and voice of an artist, while also really inspiring that artist to expand outside themselves. So this was our studio staff at the time, and at the end is Nami Yamamoto, and right next to her is Samara Golden. And basically, as this conversation starts with the visiting artists, they start to talk about dreams that the artist has and these seeds of ideas that will hopefully develop into the project. And when Samara came to us, one of her first ideas was she wanted to reproduce the experience of being on this rock, which was an overlook that overlooked the city of Stockholm and the harbor. And this rock had a very special quality where when you sat there, you felt calm and at peace. And there was a very powerful wind that blew across the rock. And it was the kind of experience where you brace yourself against the wind, but the wind also carries away all the things that you no longer want to hold on to. And so Samara really wanted to find a way to recreate this emotional experience. And so that led to a lot of really interesting explorations in the studio to try to figure out this really difficult challenge of creating a large boulder in the museum. And you could probably imagine some of the challenges of the weight of the boulder and how we would get it into the space, or if we would create it in the space and then demolish it. So the studio staff, as usual, reached out to various suppliers and industry to find a material that could represent this rock while also being lightweight and durable. And these explorations went on for a long time. And at the same time, Samara had been given a scale model of our 8th floor gallery. And this was a really important part of her process because she really likes to respond to the architecture of a space. And so this allowed her to play around within the space of the gallery on this scale and to try to start to imagine the illusion she was trying to create. And as she was doing this, she realized that there was a window that she hadn't realized was there because it had been covered over for a previous exhibition. And she realized she could take this window and she could use it to create the illusion of a lighthouse. And that was really a turning point in the residency. And you can see the rock is still there, and the little animal represents another seed of exploration where Samara, she creates work from her own emotional experiences. And it's not because she feels like her emotional experiences are more important than anyone else's, but because it's a place where she can begin that feels very true and sincere and powerful because of that. So she had an experience where she had pneumonia and she almost died. And while she was in the hospital bed, she had this vision of these animals running across the end of her hospital bed. And they were animals that seemed like they were from another dimension. They were very ephemeral and they would appear and disappear. And they seemed like they were translucent and they would pick up the patterns of the space around her. So this was also a really big challenge for our studio staff because what she wanted to create was an optical phenomenon. It wasn't something concrete and real. And so to use real materials to create something that's a phenomenon is really complicated. But the studio staff did a lot of experimentation, creating these skins that would become the animals and patterns that would fill their skins. And these patterns were actually another seed of an idea. Samara also suffers from migraines, and she sees a visual aura when she has a migraine. And she wanted to think about that, but also the fact that migraines are affected by the frequency of light. And so if you are exposed to a certain frequency, it can ease your migraine. But if that frequency is shifted just slightly, it can cause a seizure. And so this was another thing that Samara was very interested in, the really fragile line between something that can hurt you and something that can heal you. And Samara created this environment that the animals would live in. And there was a lot of experimentation within this environment to try to create this phenomenon of the animals. And at this time, the residency took a dramatic shift because Samara had a traumatic loss in her life. Her brother-in-law passed away, and it felt to her, her emotional experience of losing her brother-in-law felt like everything around her was in ruin. And she tries to recreate an emotional experience within a physical space. And so the physical space that felt right to convey this feeling of loss was a ruin, and more specifically, a flood. So she wanted to create sand dunes that had all of a person's belongings washed out onto the sand. And so she came to the studio staff with what seemed at the time like a really impossible and beautiful dream to create sand dunes on the ceiling of the museum. So if you could like wrap your mind around what that would entail to put sand dunes on a ceiling. It was a really challenging project for the studio staff to tackle. And Samara, she was actually on site at the fabric workshop much more than is typical. And that's because her process of making is very personal. And she almost like conjures materials rather than makes things, because it's very important to her that the objects within the installation have an emotional resonance and tell a particular story. So they have a quality to them that's very hard to explain or to delegate someone else to make. So she really wanted to be part of the process as much as possible. And the studio staff worked alongside her, watching the way she made things and really noticing what materials felt right to her and how she was going about recreating these everyday objects using recycled materials and found materials and things from thrift stores. And over time, they were really able to get a sense of her voice. And all these materials, what was additionally challenging about making them is they were all created in half scale. And this was so that they would fit within the scale of the illusion. And then the next thing to tackle was creating these sand dunes. So the studio staff spent a long time creating a lightweight structure that could represent these sand dunes and be strong enough to hold up, but also not so heavy that it would be hard to suspend from the ceiling. And then they started to place the objects on the sand dunes while they were still on the floor. And this was a really complicated thing to orchestrate. Um, it's hard to reproduce something that happens naturally, but in a recreating that is very difficult. And all the objects were covered with resin so that they would have the appearance of being washed out in a flood and ruined by the water. And I think for Samara, she really tries to make sure that every single element of the installation has an empathy to it, or sort of like reflects the experience of the emotional experience of the human. So like if you went out into a storm with an umbrella and you came in from the storm, you and the umbrella would resemble one another because you'd both be worn and weary and wet and kind of bedraggled. And that object would carry a certain empathy. And then the studio staff had to attach everything to the ceiling. And then, of course, another very dramatic pause occurred in the installation because on March 13th, we were told that we had to shut down the museum, and we were only given about 4 hours to pack up our things and leave. And that was especially difficult for the studio staff because they were up in cranes working on the ceiling, and they had to just put everything down and try to wrap their heads around what would happen after this moment. Would they be able to continue the installation? When would we be back? And of course, none of us knew what was going to happen. And Samara, unfortunately, had to go back home to LA. So we were actually paused, or the museum was closed for 3 months. And when we got back and we were thinking about how to represent this exhibition, it felt really important to represent this moment where we had to pause and we had to shut down and we had to leave this chaos of the studio and a half installed installation in the museum. So this was actually installed on the first floor of our museum. It was a still life of what the studio looked like when we had to leave. And you can kind of see like all the experimentation that's happening to the very last minute. And then when we were able to get back to the museum, the studio staff got back to work and they started, making sure everything was up on the ceiling and the mirrors were up. They built the boardwalk along the ceiling and worked really hard to get this process back on track. This is Abby Lutz, who is the project coordinator, and you can see she has a mirror on the floor, which is on a dolly. And what she's doing is trying to see how the illusion is working. It's such a complicated illusion, and she had to try to communicate the progress of the installation to Samara through phone calls and photographs, and it was very tricky to do. And you can see that this picture kind of shows you that there's a corridor that was created, and the only window that's physically there is half of a window. And the rest of the windows that you see are all just a reflection. And the studio staff, Zach Ingram and Alan West, worked really hard to create this faux stained glass for the window. And Avery Lawrence worked on a door, which was just a half a door, but it's actually a memory of the door that led to Samara's brother-in-law and sister's apartment building, and her memory of the last time she visited, which was during Halloween. And just this idea of the doorway to what we don't know and to the place where we go after we die and what happens to memory and to loss. And then the final part of the installation was installing the mirrors on the floor, which would complete the illusion. And once all the mirrors were in the floor, you couldn't go into the installation anymore. And I was given a really scary job of walking out onto the floor of mirrors so that I could clean them. And it was actually very scary because I was afraid I would break the mirrors, but also the illusion is so intense that as I was walking, I had to keep reminding myself that I wasn't going to fall through the floor to like the nothingness that looked like it was below me. Um, but it was also a really special moment that I really appreciated because I was I was the only one that, at that time, that was allowed to be within the installation and to really see it from the inside. And then this platform was created, which serves as sort of like a scenic overlook that you would find at like a national park. And Samara often creates a vantage point that you can see the installation from, but that you can't actually enter the installation. And this was an element that also felt deeply connected to this moment we're in, especially in the early days of the pandemic, where we were really sectioned off and kind of kept within our homes and just seeing the world through the framework of our window and trying to connect, though we were disconnected in this very physical way. And this is some images of the completed installation. And these are beautiful photographs, but it's also hard to capture what it feels like to be in that space. There's also an audio component that you can hear when you're in this space that also adds to the emotional experience. And I just wanted to end on sort of what connects this part of the story to AJ, which is that as we were really sitting within the installation and looking at what it looked like and what it felt like to be in there, we were really struck by how everything in the installation is fabricated, and it's this fabricated illusion. But the one thing that is real is what you can see from the top part of the window, which is the open sky. And so every day you can see the light, the sunrise and the sunset in the gallery, and you can see the clouds roll by. And it felt like a very important aspect of the installation, because Samara really saw this lighthouse as being a beacon, like a beacon of hope just past this ruin. And we were really trying to think of how to make that useful and connect to the experience that we're all in right now, which for many people does feel like a ruin, and what kind of hope is just beyond it. So we were thinking about how, with everything that's unprecedented and unsteady and uncertain, there is this one constant and true thing, which is that every day the the sun sets and the day closes and you have a chance to rest, and then the next morning the sun rises and you are given a new day. So we really wanted to offer that as a place to reflect and connect to this installation, just that simple thing of the sunrise and the sunset, which led to reaching out to a friend of mine who's a professor at University of Pennsylvania, Chris Callison-Birch. And I just reached out with this question, not having any experience with AI or computer programming. Just, does a computer program exist that can take the language of a regret and convert it into a command for action? And from that question, it sparked this whole conversation and exchange with AJ and his class. And it really led to something beautiful and unexpected. And I'll stop sharing my screen. But if anyone has any questions, I just threw a lot of information at everybody, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Katie. That was phenomenal. What a beautiful and just such stunning installation. I think last time we talked about it in preparation for this webinar, you talked about Samara's kind of ability to foresee what a space would look like. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because considering that she was at a distance and creating the final touches of the installation, it seems quite a feat.
Yeah, I guess my only answer for that is that it was a magical ability that she has, because I don't really understand it myself, like how she was able to see that whole illusion before it was created, and how that she knew it would work. And um, it just is a testament to her as an artist, but also to our studio staff that was able to um, really communicate the experience of what was happening to her, so she could be on top of how the progress was going. But it is a um, magical thing I don't totally understand.
Amazing. Amazing. Great. Well, we can also come back to questions in more specificity about the installation and the artist at the end. But AJ, do you want to tell us a little bit more detail about the creation and the inspiration for the project A Day Ends, A Day Begins?
Yeah, thanks Katie and Vita for the introduction. Yeah, so I'll be talking a little bit more about the AI project that I put together with Katie after she approached my advisor at Penn. And just to start off with, I'll kind of go through some examples of where the worlds of AI and art have kind of collided before. And maybe you've seen some of these examples because they've been in popular media or news articles before. But one really common use case for AI and art is the idea of using neural networks to do this task called neural style transfer. And it's a task where you can take an image and then take another image from an artist that you might really like, and then transform your first image into the style of the second image. So for example, in this slide, you can kind of see this photo of San Francisco, I think, being taken of these houses. And then the person here has selected a painting by Van Gogh. And the neural network is able to kind of observe the style of what's going on in the second painting and then apply the same style to the first photo and output this like mixture of the two. And it's a little bit beyond just like the normal filter that you would find in a photo sharing app, where it's just manipulating the colors, but it's actually kind of redrawing the content in the style. And this is another like pretty good example of the Mona Lisa being done in a variety of different styles. Obviously the one in the middle is, again, the Starry Night. But then you can also see some other really interesting examples. And you can see the AI kind of having to figure out how to represent, let's say, fingers on her hand, and those being represented by the wave in the Great Wave painting. And then another really common example is neural networks that operate on text. And this is one of the models that would be used for what I was thinking would be useful for what Katie was suggesting. And it's the idea that neural networks can look at a bunch of text and then try to predict what text from that domain might look like if it had to generate on its own. So here we have a neural network that's kind of been trained on looking at a bunch of samples of Shakespeare, and then it's been prompted to go out and generate its own monologues from different characters in Shakespeare all on its own. And it does a pretty good job of outputting plausible looking text, not necessarily correct or meaningful all the time, but especially when it comes to works that are open to interpretation, it can do a pretty good job at trying to imitate its source material. And a larger point that I think, a larger point that I think is interesting to make between these two domains is that they're really kind of doing the same thing. If you think about art, a lot of what artists do is take something that they've experienced before or what they've seen in their life before, other works by other artists throughout the course of their life, what they've learned through their experiences, and then put them together to create something new. And nothing that anyone creates is absolutely new. It's usually a mixture of a bunch of things that they've seen before, or things that they've experienced in order to create something new. And neural networks, even though it's a very technical domain, you'll often find text that that talks about them looking at millions of samples of data points, remixing them in order to produce an output or to classify something. And it's really the same thing. It's kind of what drives a lot of people in AI to think about is whether AI and humans are really the same machine. One is just way more complex than the other, because they both really just take a look at a bunch of things that they've seen before and then recombine them into something new. And if you're more interested in some of these other things, there's a creativity workshop at a really popular machine learning conference called NeurIPS that actually goes through a bunch of research papers that machine learning researchers write on the domain of collaboration between AI and artwork. So you could visit this website and maybe see some examples of some of these other projects. But shifting back to the project that we did for the museum, Katie had this idea of having these two prompts being kind of like the center of the AI model, where the first prompt is something that a human would respond to, and then the second prompt would be something that the AI would respond to, looking at what the human put as their answer for the first prompt, and then trying to generate a message of empathy or hope. So an example of two valid answers or any answers to this prompt, these prompts might look like something like this. So the goal was really to design an AI system and a website that participants from the museum could interact with, where they could put in this prompt and then have an AI generate the second prompt. And then maybe we could show a gallery of these responses to attendees of the exhibit. And when I first saw this, I initially thought, there's this model called OpenAI's GPT-2 model, and you might have also maybe heard about this in the news. It's pretty popular, but it's a model that's basically been trained by OpenAI. They're like a nonprofit institute that generates machine learning models, and it's been trained over billions of pieces of text over the internet. So looking at things like social media posts and news articles and Wikipedia articles in order to understand human language. And that was going to be like the basis of the AI model that we'll use to generate the answer to the second prompt. And when I was talking to Katie about this, we were talking about whether we would need a lot of training data or whether we'd be able to get a lot of training data, because usually for machine learning, you would need thousands or millions of examples for the AI to properly learn what it's supposed to do. But because we're using this pre-trained model that OpenAI has already run over billions of pieces of text, I thought maybe we could get away with less examples. And it turned out that it did end up working. But obviously, the more examples, the more training data that we could get from attendees of the museum, then the better the AI generated responses would be. Because at first they'll kind of just look like random noise, almost kind of something that would be outputted from your phone if you just use the auto suggestion on the top of the keyboard to write an entire piece of text. And then the last piece to the project was we wanted to create a website where attendees could kind of access it, help train the AI, so send in answers for the first prompt and the second prompt, a page where they could generate their own AI responses, so just enter in the first prompt and then have the AI give them back the second prompt. And then a gallery view where you could see all the AI responses from that other people had generated from their first response to the prompt. So what we did was we generated we created this page where people could respond to the first prompt, and because they would be training the AI at first, also respond to the second prompt. And this is a design that we came up with for the train page. And I'm kind of a fan of minimalistic web design. So I kind of like the idea of just splitting it 50-50 on the page, having the first half be focused on the first prompt, the second half be focused on the second prompt, but then also doing this positive space, negative space type of distinction between the two to make it clear that one side was the human, one side was the AI. Because when we move on to the page where the AI will actually be generating the responses, it would be nice if it was if there was an affordance kind of that would show the difference between the two different prompts. And then once a user enters in their response to the first one and the second one, they can submit, and then the responses are stored on the server, and then we would train the AI model to output responses to the second prompt, learning from what everybody had entered into both of these prompts. So that was kind of the idea behind the model. And in order to generate these AI responses, the AI was fine-tuned. This is a term that we use for training a machine learning model that's already kind of been trained. So like I mentioned, the OpenAI GPT-2 model is already trained over billions of pieces of text on the internet. So because of that, we only had to fine-tune it over the training data that we collected from users of this website. So when we got a bunch of responses from people on the website, I fine-tuned training the model. And basically what that would do is it would make the responses look a lot more closer to what people were putting in on the website. And the notion of how close the output is to what you want it to look like is called coherence in machine learning, like how coherent is the text. Whether it looks like random noise, that'd be less coherent, or whether it looks like, you know, the type of thing that you want it to be outputting would be more coherent. And then a knob that I was adjusting while I was generating the AI responses is called the temperature of the model. And this is kind of a setting where if you set the temperature low, you can kind of imagine it as temperature on of a stove with a pot of boiling water on it. If you turn the temperature really high, then it makes the boiling water really volatile, and there'll be a lot of bubbling on the surface. And the idea is when you turn the temperature of the model really high, you get a lot of variability on its output. So you'll get a lot of different crazy kind of out there responses from the AI. If you turn the temperature really low, you'll get a lot of similar responses from the AI where it's being more conservative in how it's responding back to the user. So after training the model, choosing the value for the temperature and the coherence, I created a website that would communicate with the server and then run the AI model on the server and then return the response back to the website. And this is kind of what it looks like. Because the AI model takes a lot of computational power, it's actually kind of slow to actually generate a response. It takes 10 to 15 seconds for a response to come back from the server. And instead of just waiting there while the user is waiting for a response from the AI, we wanted to kind of add a human touch to make it feel like it was almost like a human on the other side when the response is coming back. So for example, we added animations like ellipses blinking on the page, and that kind of reminds you of maybe a messaging app where you have a typing indicator in a chat while someone else is typing and you're waiting for the response. And then when the response finally comes back in, instead of just displaying the response, it will kind of like animate out the typing in a typewriter animation type of format. And that kind of just makes it feel like the AI is typing the response up live, even though it's already been pre-generated on the server. So just adding in touches like that to make it feel all the more human were interesting things that we decided to add on this page. And then this is the final presentation of what we did. And this was basically all of the AI responses that people had generated. So the human had entered in this phrase, and the AI would respond with this blue phrase. In order to make sure that everybody could see all of the responses, we put them in a scrolling page, in a scrolling animation on this page, so that it would scroll from the oldest to the newest, so you could see how the AI progressed after it's been trained with more and more responses and how it's improved over time. Now, because we don't have hundreds or thousands of examples to run through the system, they're still not super coherent and not the best responses that you could come up with, but they work somewhat well, and some of them kind of seem to make sense almost. And then finally, we chose to keep the color scheme the same on this page, where this like pink or purple color kind of represents what the human wrote, and the blue color represents what the AI wrote. And if you look at the previous page, it kind of matches the color scheme on this page, just so that people have a sense of consistency when they move between pages and can understand what the humans are writing and what the AI is writing. And then the final thing that we needed to do was, because a lot of these AI models are trained over the open internet, and there's a lot of things on the open internet, of course, that you don't want to seep into your model. A lot of biases that exist, or negative or inappropriate content. We wanted to make sure that the AI system was not generating that on the page. So I noticed that there were a lot of outputs coming out of the AI system that could easily be blocked by just adding a blacklist of words that we did not want to show. And whenever it encounters one of the words that I added to the blacklist, it would basically go back and try to generate a new response without using any of those words. So trying to basically underweight any responses that were coming with those words and overweight ones that were coming without those words. So that's another piece that we had to kind of add for this final presentation layer. But yeah, I think that's it for the project. I mean, we can do an interactive demo maybe where people can put in some responses to the first prompt in the chat, and I can put them into the website and see what the AI responds with. Hopefully good responses since we're doing this live.
Yeah, that would be great. Before we start with the demo, I just wanted to follow up on sort of this idea of empathy and developing empathy in the AI, and how you were sort of thinking through that as you were creating this project.
Yeah, so it's tough to, it is really tough to control how, like what it talks about, because at the end of the day, it's a bunch of, like it's millions of numbers that control the output of it. So there's no easy way to tell it, I want to produce hopeful messages versus negative messages on the output. So some of the messages that it comes up with, if the first prompt is really negative, like I had an awful day, it'll say that tomorrow is also going to be really awful, unfortunately, which is not maybe what we wanted as the output. But the more data that we give it and the more examples of the second prompt that we give it, the better it will learn to mimic the sentiment of what people are inputting as a second response. So some of them, you know, do turn out to be pretty positive. Most, I think the majority of them do turn out to be pretty positive. But that's how it kind of learns to mimic, let's say, the feeling of empathy on the output.
Great. So it's really more of a mimicking of empathy than an actual development of empathy, though it's, yeah, it's interesting to think about what's the difference there, but very cool. So yeah, if there's not any questions for AJ, maybe we could do a quick demo and actually see this project live.
Yeah, does anybody have an example of something that they want to put in intro?
Yeah, if you guys put your responses into the chat box, AJ can type them in, and we can all sort of see it in process together.
And it does take some time to respond. So I think it'll be like 20 seconds or so for it to come back, but hopefully it'll work.
I wanted to just add, Vita, that we had changed the language from,
Well, yeah, good message. First one feels negative, but I'll try some others. But yeah, feel free to talk while I'm doing this.
We had started with, at the end of today, I feel blank, but then we switched it to we as a way of sort of expanding outside of our own selves. This time has been like isolating in so many ways, and it felt like a way of just encouraging us all to think about like who is we and how are we feeling as opposed to I.
Interesting. I do love the thinking expression that you gave it, AJ.
Thanks, yeah.
Katie, how does Samara feel about this added project?
Oh, I think she's excited about it. Samara unfortunately hasn't been able to see the finished installation at the museum because of the pandemic. So I think we're all just hoping to connect as many people as we can to the exhibit because it's so special, and it's so hard for everyone to see it in the way they normally would.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell us a little bit about your reopening and how we would be able to come and see the exhibit while it's still up. Do you have time tickets, or how are you guys working that?
Yeah, so we do have a time ticketing system, and you can just register online for a ticket, and it's really feels very comfortable in the museum. It's such a large space, and we are very careful about the numbers we admit. So it's a really peaceful experience to come see the exhibit. And we also have Big Wash, Jonathan Lyndon Chase, which is open now as well.
Another phenomenal show. Yes.
Yeah, I think it might be a little bit slow right now, maybe because people are accessing it all at the same time. But oh, this one's, there you go, a positive message.
That's hopeful.
But yeah.
Nice. Great. Well, this has been so phenomenal. Any questions for Katie or AJ? AJ, are there things that you're learning from the AI's response that you're noticing that are sort of surprising to you that you didn't expect?
I was kind of surprised that it was able to, somewhat work with how few responses that we put into the system. I was actually expecting at the beginning of this that we would need, millions of examples, because that's generally what you hear, Google or Amazon using when they're training an AI model. But surprisingly, it did work somewhat well for this use case. Like, it's not outputting complete random words when you're generating responses. So I thought it was pretty plausible that you could use it for a smaller use case like this. So I thought that was interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what do you think the afterlife of this project might be? Are you going to take it on the road, AJ?
Maybe I'll let Katie speak to that.
It opened up a lot of possibilities for us at the museum because it's really important for us to gauge how people feel about the work that we show, and also how we're doing at translating the work and communicating the voice of the artist. So it's really helpful to have this tool to gather reflections and to offer a way of connecting that we didn't realize or didn't think to use before. So I think it will lead to other projects and other ideas that connect to people through technology.
And AJ, how does this project fit into your doctoral research?
Yeah, so there's like a couple of different areas of AI that you can work on, and my particular area is like understanding text. So how do we build models that like read text and then understand the meaning from them? But there are other students in our lab. One is she's actually writing her final dissertation thesis on generating text and developing storylines from text using these models. So this is not my particular area of research, but I thought it would be a fun project to take on, particularly because I haven't really worked with this part of AI before. I mostly work on the understanding of text portion, but there are other people in my machine learning lab who do work on this problem. So I thought it was interesting to kind of learn about, some of these models and put them into practice for this project.
Absolutely. Cool. Yeah, I also really love the interactive quality, especially during these times of being so isolated under COVID restrictions. Having this place to sort of connect even to an artificial intelligence in this moment of somebody or something answering your question or answering you know, giving you some kind of comment, really, I feel like is a touching experience. So I really love this project, and I'm so glad we had a chance to really dive deep into it and learn so much more about it. Well, if there's no other questions, I would say we will wrap up. And Katie and AJ, thank you so much for this really incredible presentation, for all your work on this. It's really great to be able to connect with other institutions for Fleisher, and it seems like the silver lining of going virtual is that there's a lot more ease of bringing us together as institutions in Philadelphia and supporting each other. So thank you so much for being on our platform here tonight. Yeah, thanks to Fabric Workshop for everybody who's here tonight. Thanks for coming. And do check out our coming up events from Fleisher from a Distance on our website. We hope to see you here again. And otherwise, have a great night, everyone. Have a great night, AJ and Katie. Thank you so much. Stay safe and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vita. Yeah.